Yeah, so
And there we
welcome to
are.
another, episode. But
As we're
um,
saying,
as we were saying,
look in
so
your Palantir to get caught up.
you're right. Tune in next time on the Palantir. Same Palantir time, same Palantir channel. Wouldn't that be neat if the Palantir had channels and you could like switch back and forth? You get tired of watching Sauron, you switch to I Love Lucy. Only it's I Love Lucia or something, or I Love
Hey,
Arathel.
Lucy. That's
I love
funny.
Arathel. Megalyn and Arathel. Megalyn's like, one more time, Lucy. You got the back of my hand.
Uh, uh,
Anyways, what I say? Yeah. So I did this recording of Wells, and what was really stunning to me was how long term the ideas that Wells and the other Fabians were putting forth at the time. They just don't go away. They don't die easily. It's like a vampire. You have to like stab it through the heart, cut its head off, bury it in concrete, and then put holy water on it. It just won't go down. But it really gives a powerful insight into what Chesterton and Lewis and Belloc and our man, Mr. Tolkien, I think, were all writing against. I'm absolutely convinced now that Lord of the Rings and probably Silmarillion were addressing this thing, if nothing else, subconsciously, if not consciously, subconsciously.
mhm.
Because one of the things we noticed with the H.G. Wells book, um, this sucker here, the Open Conspiracy, one of the things we noticed about this is that it really reads more like a Bible, a Bible for the progressive movement. It's like
You're
a
still sharing Amazon, by the way.
oh right, sorry, beg your pardon.
It's all right.
Where do I want to go? Here we go. That's a nice visual.
Okay.
Um, it reads like a Bible. It's like the whole of
Hmm.
this book by H.G. Wells, The Open Conspiracy, is like a counter spell to the Bible, setting up a way of
Hmm.
thinking about the world or a way of addressing reality, which is different from how the Bible established Western culture, basically. Because I think we could all agree that Western culture, if nothing else, has a great deal to owe to the Bible, if not saying that the Bible is the seminal work for Western culture, in addition to some other blokes like Plato and all. Because it
Hmm.
really forms, we think of, as Westerners, we think of the world as created by a benevolent God who creates with a purpose and creates in an ordered, logical way and creates man and woman different in order to be helpmates to one another, right? And so that's deeply ingrained in Western thought, if we can call it that. And then you come along with H.G. Wells, and what he proposes in the very start of the thing that there's a chaos in the world, there's a storm in the world, and you get this sense of like the Tehom as he's describing it. He's describing this world of darkness and chaos and fluidity, and everything's changing very fast, but there's no creator in there. There's never any mention of creator. The thing that's going to save us is man himself, and specifically
Hmm.
male peoples, not
Not
females,
just Anthropos, but
but
Anir, Homo.
Veer, yeah, yeah,
Yeah, revered.
and
Yes.
that man's helpmate in the opening of this section is not woman, it's machines. That by the use of technology and science and machines, man will conquer all these things and close what he calls, and this is really stunning to me, close what he calls the gap of distance. And so there will be an abolition of distance. And when he wrote that phrase in quotation marks, the abolition of distance,
Hmm.
immediately clued to my man C.S. Lewis. And I thought that's got to be what Lewis was talking about. Lewis publishes
Hmm.
his work only 10 years later
Oh,
after this.
interesting.
So
The
he
abolition of distance. He's like, no, the abolition of man.
abolition of man. And Lewis says
Yeah.
explicitly that's what's going to happen. You praise the abolition of distance, you praise the abolition of toil, and what you end up with is essentially the abolition of humanity itself. So, if Lewis and Chesterton and Belloc and all these other luminaries on the Christian side were writing against this movement, I can't imagine that Tolkien was sitting around saying, "Oh, it doesn't matter. I don't have to do anything at all. It's a passing fad or whatever." I suspect he probably was seeing this too and wrote in his own way a work which he denies having any allegorical stance, any allegorical
Hmm.
structure. But I honestly think it's a counter spell.
Oh, yeah. Well, I mean, but it's precisely. Well, but he says as much. I mean, that's exactly it. Like, it's not allegory; it's a counterspell.
Yeah.
He just
Okay,
doesn't say
so
them necessarily in the same sentence, but it's
let me
very
ask you
much. Yeah.
let me ask you for clarity, and I probably have
Hmm.
asked this before, so bear with me. But what are
Hmm.
we talking about when we talk about counterspell versus allegory? What's the difference between these two?
Yeah. Well, alleg. Now, one thing is to remember that we're dealing with a philologist, same position you find yourself in right now, listening to me, and so
Mhm.
a specialist with words who's I mean, this is his whole world, and his bread and butter is not just precision of terms, but technical terms like allegory that we might throw around like Americans shooting off bullets.
Right.
It's imprecise, right? It's allegory. We almost use that in the way to mean anything that represents something. Period. Anything that has meaning, oh, it's allegorical. Like, no, you mean it like it's a story that has a moral to it. It's not
Mhm.
really allegorical, or it's a symbol, or it's a. There are many other different kind of technical terms we throw that out. So, what does Tolkien mean by allegory? He doesn't mean that, when he says allegory, that does not encompass everything that potentially has meaning or significance. The term for that would be sign or signifier or semeo, would be the broad term, right? But yeah. Anyway, what he means is very, very specifically as a literary type of thing, right?
Mhm.
Where allegory is where you have one thing stands in for another thing.
Mhm.
It's a direct stand-in. So the Nazguls are and only are Nazis, or SS,
Oh, I see what you're saying. Yep.
officers. That's an allegory. The ring
Yeah.
is the atomic bomb. That's an allegory.
Yeah.
That would be an allegorical reading, and that's his intent. You could read it that way. You could also read that all is an allegory. The ring could be crack cocaine. There's ways of reading, interpreting something in an allegorical fashion. Um, I'm not saying that's a legitimate way to. People can do that. People do that. People read orcs as African American subtype, African Americans.
Mhm.
Of course, Tolkien was never in America, whatever. But the point is, it's they can read into it things allegorically, but it may or may not have anything to do with what the author's intent is. This is what we would call overinterpretation.
Mm.
Um, and the otherwise allegorically, we could on the author's intent. He could write it as an allegory, like C.S. Lewis. The lion is Jesus. Aslan is Jesus. Jesus is Aslan. That's how that is. It's an allegory,
Yeah.
and he's
Yeah.
fine with that. Um,
And that's far more like Pilgrim's Progress or something like
Pilgrim's
that.
Progress
Yeah.
is exactly right.
Exactly. Yeah.
You can have allegories be so forced or so obvious as like even C.S. Lewis's Space Trilogy, where the hero who redeems mankind is named Ransom. Just in case you didn't get it, he's gonna ransom the people. Then it's you're really into Bunyan. I get it.
Yes.
Uh,
Much as I like C.S. Lewis, you're right. He does that much more often. Yes.
and it's
Yeah. And
but that's
if I
allegory. But what is Tolkien instead? Then what is he writing instead? He in his famous quote where he's saying, no, this is not allegory. There's nothing allegorical about it. Applicability, sure. He's using layman's terms here, but in the broad sense of applicability, yeah, there are lessons. There's you know, it's I was going to say there's a spiritual sense, but there are things you can read the story like what it is it's myth,
yes,
right?
right.
No myth, see,
Yeah.
any Greek myth that in its real form, real as we can get it, right? Authentic form, let's say, is not merely allegorical, right? There's a legitimate level of allegory reading the story of Eros and what do we call it? Psyche and
Psyche,
Eros,
yeah.
right? Yeah. Where psyche literally is the Greek word for mind or soul, and eros is literally the Greek word for like loving desire, yearning, right? Or erotic love. Erotic love wakens, or the mind or the soul, young woman the soul. She awakens erotic desire right and disaster happens because it was too soon, it wasn't the right time. You can go through that and say, oh, there's an allegorical reading to this. And that would, there's an allegorical reading to that myth. But it's also so much more than that, right?
Mm-hmm.
And in the same way, you can read, Moses leading the Hebrews out of Egypt, across the Red Sea, out of slavery into the Promised Land. There's a way of reading that allegorically that we could say is a perfectly legitimate way, but there are other levels of meaning to that as well. Tolkien is very explicit in these works, not necessarily all his works, but in the Middle-earth legendarium. He's not right. He's intentionally avoiding allegory because he thinks allegory is too simplistic. And it's true because he's at the process of trying to create myth, which is to say a story that touches on eternal and universal truths that certainly find applicable circumstances all across our lives and all across history, which is why we have a very, very long-running podcast series. There are so many different things that this connects to, that this ties into. And he does say, of course, in the letter that we've referred to time and time again, that if it's about anything, it's about the fall, mortality, and the machine.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, that's what it's about. And these are universal principles.
Right. Which is why, for instance, when I talked about his responding to the movement of progressivism, I don't think that his works are like an allegorical response. I think they're a counterspell, which is a different thing. And let me go back for just a minute to point out two things. One is that I remember that Charles Williams talks about in his letters on Dante about the figura idea, which I think is a decent idea to throw out. Where in a work the figura is that the image or the person, the character, is both the historical character, the actual connection to reality, and the character in the book, and representing something else all at the same time. The three different realms don't negate. So, like, he takes Virgil, and Virgil is the actual poet there from Roman history, but he's now the character as he speaks and moves in the poem, and then he also represents whatever it is, intellect or poetic creation,
different things at different stages in Dante's journey.
Yeah, sure. And so that you can extract meaning from those three realms, but you can't say, oh, this is definitely the historical Virgil, because Virgil definitely went to hell, or whatever. That's illicit. The other thing that is also intriguing is what Dante himself says in his letter to not Caligari, that's the pit of Caligari or whatever. His Can Grande, right? His letter to Can Grande. It's Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, letter to Can Grande, whatever. In his letter to Can Grande, he talks about the four levels of meaning and the literal, the allegorical, the tropological, and the anagogical. And he says that the upper three, allegorical, anagogical, moral, and anagogical, are all of them part of allegory. So he's using that term in two different ways. One as the whole realm where the thing's representing something else. So allegory is about that, where A represents something else. But also allegory is how this image connects to other images in literature and history and the like. So I think that's worthwhile thinking about, because when you think about Aragorn, for instance, Aragorn connects to other literary heroes, that we see. He connects to.
I mean, there's the Arthur type.
And the Arthur, right. Yeah. So he connects to all those things. So he's troping those images, but he's not saying directly this is Gawain, or this is Galahad.
Right. Okay. No, I think that's exactly it. That's exactly it. Now, I hesitate to say to agree with what Dante wrote. Say, well, these three are also allegory. We talk about allegory in the broad sense because it's rather different than what we mean by allegory nowadays, even in our imprecise use. The same way with the word symbol, right? Symbol meant something much more profound. It almost means the opposite of what we mean today. Or awful. Yes. Awful used to be a good thing. This place is awful. Terribile es loco esto.
It's it's funny how words change like that. You know, even in our day, we used to say things like "rad, man," "deaf," or
Oh, yeah.
"That's sick, man. That's so
Radical.
sick, radical," yeah, which all meant it's good.
Radical
You
meant good.
know,
Now it's like
yeah,
TSA is going to take you aside and have some private time with
yeah,
you.
yeah. Radicals, you won't take your shoes off at the airport. You know, that kind of thing.
Right. Um,
So when he's writing this work, I honestly think that he was thinking or considering or pondering, mulling over, if you will, the problems that he was seeing in the current world. And that's the machine element that he talks
yeah,
about.
absolutely.
And
Absolutely.
but what he does, he doesn't go and respond directly the way that Chesterton does, or doesn't respond directly the way that Belloc does.
Right. Which is why he's better than both of them. One, he's not a journalist.
Yes, right.
Chesterton's just a journalist with as much bombast as you could expect from a
That's
journalist.
right. Exactly. Yeah.
I mean, like, as much as I respect him, like Rod Dreher is a journalist today.
He is
He
what he
might
is.
write some good
Exactly.
things,
Yeah.
but at the end of it, you have to calibrate your expectations. The fact that he's a journalist and bombastic. Chesterton's
Hmm.
the same. He was the journalist. He was the Rod Dreher of his time,
Yeah.
um, and with with a lot more ale involved. Um,
And cigarettes.
and a lot more ale and cigarettes involved. Um, but Roger, if you're out there, love you. You're good. Um, give me a call next time you're in Italy. The where was I going with that? Oh, Tolkien's not that, right? He's an Oxford
No.
professor of Old English. I guess we can't say Anglo-Saxon anymore,
Yeah,
but
right.
Old English.
Yeah,
But he
quieter. He's a much quieter man.
is, and he recognizes something that I think actually that to be I want to be fair to Rod. Rod does recognize and he's actually explicitly spoken about. Um, he recognizes something that Chesterton doesn't really recognize. He recognizes something that many others don't. The polemicists do not, because he's well. He recognizes that in these other writings that he's writing against, their danger lies not in what they propose, the object content of their spell, of their story, but in the way that it's crafted. Their danger lies not in the content of what they write, but the danger lies in their craft,
Mm.
in the sense that we mean that in English, and craft in its German meaning power, force, strength, right? It's the fact that what they are doing is a black magic spell, right?
Mm.
Hitler is bad for a lot of reasons. One of the things that the Nazi ideology, but Tolkien takes specific like Nazi ideology, eugenicist ideology, machine ideology, the technocrats, and is Walter Disney, his depiction of dwarves and everything. His reframing of old wives' tales and fairy stories are all dangerous for the same reason. You think with Disney's innocuous, right? It's just telling kids stories.
Not anymore.
But doing it in a way that guts them of their actual meaning and injects them with other meaning is the fact that all of these are in Tolkien. Whether you agree or disagree with Tolkien, this is what Tolkien is proposing. They're weaving black magic spells, and
Mm.
so writing it. So H.G. Wells thing, the with the Open
Open
Conspiracy,
conspiracy. Yeah.
you don't write an essay against that because it's an essay. Is it? Let somebody else do that, but it's not. It's not an essay. It looks like an essay. That's the form it takes. That's this apple is not an apple, right? It's poison, Snow White. It's no
Right. It's
ordinary
very good.
apple. It looks like an apple, but it ain't an apple.
This pipe is not a
Um,
pipe.
right. Sissy n'est pas un peep.
Yeah.
We could get really weird in there, but the essay is not just not an essay. It's a black magic spell.
Yeah.
It just comes in the form of an essay, right?
Yeah.
Your
Yeah.
LSD can come in a lot of
Yeah.
different shapes and sizes.
I see what you're saying because like what Mr. Hitler did, he was a fantastic speaker apparently, and he worked a crowd up into a frenzy. He worked them into a lather. You know,
Mm-hmm.
and the records show that he would always begin small, and we see him yelling and screaming and pounding the podium. That was the latter end of his speeches. his speeches would begin small and then build and build and build because he would work these crowds up into these emotional frenzies. That the black magic spell um, was in the ability to stir emotions, especially emotions of violence and hatred. There's a really good scene, if I remember, there's a really good scene in the Ralph Bakshi um, Lord of the Rings, which I remember you've seen, and I think if anybody else has seen, where Saruman is speaking to his hordes of orcs. And God love him, Bakshi, he did some things really well. And that scene just always stuck with me because it's a Hitlerian speech. You know, he's
Yes.
stirring these orcs up. They don't need a lot of stirring, but he's stirring these orcs up into a frenzy before they attack. Before they attack. It's not Minas Tirith at that point. It's Helm's Deep, right?
Right,
Right below
right,
Helm's
yeah.
Deep. So
And I think he depicts that for all the kind of goofiness in Bakshi's thing, that particular scene, he does immensely better
yeah,
than with the Ewok's name. What's his
yeah.
Jackson,
Jackson.
than Peter
Yeah.
Jackson does
A
with
side note.
that.
Led Zeppelin was actually contacted to do music for Bakshi's movie.
Shit.
That's serious, I know, but they didn't have time. They wanted to, but they didn't have time because they were in the midst of recording their four,
Jeez.
like number four, whatever. Can you imagine what that movie would have
Oh
been
man.
like?
Oh my gosh.
Wow. I tell you, somebody has to do a remake of Lord of the Rings. Well, okay, so going back to this, then the other thing is this counter spell. Because if, for instance, you do write an essay against H.G. Wells, which, by the way, Belloc, I think, did, if I'm not mistaken,
I
is
believe that's true.
either Belloc or Lewis. I know Lewis in his Abolition of Man was probably writing against this. And the essays do a really good job of counter, like hitting on a logical level. And I respect so many of these journalists today who do this as well. They critique the silliness and the evil and the goofiness that goes on. I respect what they do, but what they do is it's not long lasting. It has an immediate effect, and then you kind of forget that such and such a journalist wrote this, or that such and such a commentator said this. Because
Mhm.
time moves on. And what Tolkien did had a much longer lasting effect to it. And I think he thought in a much broader scope. He was
Mhm.
considering rewriting the Arthur story before he said, I don't think that's going to be where my talent should be
Right.
invested. And instead, he went with Silmarillion and Lord of the Rings. And I
And
think that was a great decision because look at what
yeah.
has happened with the longevity of his story and the fan base and the growth of the mythology around the good growth of the mythology around
Mhm.
his story. He essentially, he says, created a secondary world, right? And I
Right.
tend to think that's what he was. That's what a counterspell I think does, right? It creates a
Ye-
secondary world.
Yeah. And I think, or I mean, this is where to back to the level of the anagogical, right?
Mm,
As a level of meaning. He's explicitly trying to do that, and he says so explicitly in the essay on fairy stories. Right. But what does anagogical mean? It means lead you out of,
yes.
right? But that's what it means to lead you out of something into something else. And that's where he's talking about escapism.
Yeah.
Is escapism, when you say escapism as in a pejorative way, what you mean is a soldier deserting from the front lines. That's not you've got a category error. That's not the situation we find ourselves in. And I think that would be Tolkien's criticism of the journalists who are approaching things as the culture wars. They're
Yeah.
approaching things as a battle on the front lines. Is no, we're all under a black magic spell and we're living in prison. Escape is precisely what we need to do.
Right.
Stop answering the question, how many light bulbs are there? How many fingers am I holding up? No,
Yeah.
we need to get out of there. You need to
Yeah.
get out of the cave, out of the prison. And so this attempts to show you a way out, or at least to lead you in some way. It seems to be an Ariadne's thread, right?
Yes, that's a very good example of the Ariadne thread. The way that it works too, as far as I perceive it, is that when you're doing what would we call it, the direct polemical, the direct journalistic
Mm-hmm.
approach, when you're doing that, you can get so wrapped up in the constant talking about the particulars, who did what to whom and what was right,
Exactly.
wrong, that I think there's a level of almost manic involvement in that, and also despair, because it's
Hmm.
always just one damn thing after another. So with this counterspell, with this secondary world thing, I think what happens is you end up thinking about why does Feanor make those Silmarils? You know, why does Arathel try to escape from her city? You know, why does Galadriel not talk about the kinslaying? You know, you start thinking about all these things. It's like Jane Austen. You start thinking about whether or not Elizabeth Bennet was making the right decisions, or whether or not at the end of the story she's expecting a child. And you think about it, and you discuss it with other people, and you have little tea parties or get-togethers where you discuss it. And after a while, I think what it does is it actually changes the way that you deal with crises and you deal with issues that are immediate. You know, you almost like put them in their own place. This is important, but it's not really as important as whether or not there's going to be a ball there at
Hmm.
in the town. That
Right.
kind of thing.
Because this is what's more effective, is things that shape and change the way that you think and see the world, the way in
Well,
which you be in the world. And that's what's for good or for evil, right? That's what's good, and that's what's also in the most insidious. It's not
yeah.
something that gives you a logical argument. I did oh goodness, some years ago, I did 3 or 4 years of researching this phenomenon of shaping character, shaping habits, personality, mindset, all that kind of stuff is probably. And and it turns out things along the logical lines, the rational, the instructions, explicit statements that are made, things you're supposed to think, content knowledge, right? Those things have a very, very surface level. Cumulatively,
Mm.
yeah, they can start to wear you down, but a very, very surface level. Um, it doesn't go very deep into changing you to become a monster or to heal you, right?
Yeah.
That's why reading self-help books tends not to actually, fix you, right? You've got to
Yeah.
change and do things. Um, but there's three basic modes of formative influence, things that can shape you, change you, and all that. Have an impact on who you are, how you see things, how you relate to others in the world. One is, of course, the logical, right? These rational stuff, rational thinking, words, instructions, essays, whatnot, rules, laws. Another is the aesthetic. Or I say
Mm.
I'll just jump this actually. Number three is relational,
Okay.
right? So logical, aesthetic, and relational. So relational is the influence of somebody has a big impact on you, right? You've got a relationship with somebody, and that was a great person, or that was an evil person, but they just make you feel yuck.
Yeah. Yeah.
That changes you in some way, right? You can't pinpoint what it is, but it's the encounter with another human being, right? So that has an influence on you. The people you're around, you tend to pick up their habits, okay? But then there's the aesthetic. The aesthetic mode is your environment, whether physical environment or moral environment. And that is the way the visuals that you're surrounded with, not words. The words can be included, words packaged in visuals. The song you can't get out of your head, the visual image that accompanies whatever Nazi propaganda message. See, the
Hmm.
real thing about propaganda, like why is propaganda so effective? What is it about propaganda? Is that, what sticks in your mind and therefore what shapes your imagination and thereby your social imaginary, the world you live in, um, or the world as you live in it, is the image, right? Is the image of the
Yeah.
Marlboro Man with his
Right.
burly thing
Right.
and a pack of cigarettes. It's not any other slogan that goes
Yeah.
along with it. It's the image of the, for thinking Goebbels. Like, why was Goebbels good at what he did? He was bad. He was evil. Why was he effective at doing what he did as the propagandist minister for the Third Reich? It wasn't about the words that are on the sign or the advertisement about a particular class or race of people. It was about the image that you couldn't get out of your head of craven, money grubbing leech on society, that you make this connection. You're like, that, and you can't stop thinking about them in that way, right?
Yeah, and
Um,
on the other hand, you can't stop thinking about those snappy uniforms by Hugo Boss and how good looking all those guys are, their haircuts. I mean, you
Bingo.
want to be like that. Yeah.
Exactly. Well, that's exactly right. You said, well, hey, bright future. It's not about the words bright future. It's not about the content of any of the speeches. It's about the spell that's being woven, about the
Yeah.
image of what I am, about who we are, about what we're
Hmm.
doing. And that can be twisted very much for evil, as we were just talking about, but that can also be the way that those spells, those wicked spells, are broken. That can be
Yeah.
the way in which people are brought back to the light. Because if you've ever tried to argue with a Nazi, you're not going to get very far. If you ever tried to argue with a hardline neo-Leninist, and I don't mean your average Marxist. I mean over there, across the pond, we've got some old vintage Bolsheviks here. You
Hmm.
know, your campus crusaders for Marx don't have anything on on the whole. Stalin was a little soft kind of crowd. and and
Yeah.
it's
Wow.
amazing. But you can't reason. The point is you can't reason with them because it's not a matter of reason,
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
right?
Yeah. Yeah. It's really
It's a
interesting.
spell of wizard. It's a contest of wizardry.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, I'm not into the game Warhammer. I respect the community. Uh, um, Henry Cavill is into it, and a lot of other people. Is a huge phenomenon, and it's going through some DEI problems right now. So, but my son is into it, and I'm listening to him talk to somebody else on the net, and this whole world is developed in the Warhammer series about the Emperor and his soldiers and how the Empire developed and the enemies they face and what kind of weapons they use and the type of starships and it's not glamour necessarily, but there's a sort of attraction being involved in this very complex, I will say, world that's developed completely from the minds of individuals. And I'm not saying whether it's good or bad thing. That's secondary. What was interesting to me was just how involved and engaging it can be for somebody to latch onto it and just to think about it and start talking with others about it. And in doing so, not be talking about um, DEI issues necessarily, or talking about whether or not the bomb's going to drop. It's sort of like this this world allows you an escapism from the sort of tawdry stuff that you have to deal with on the street on a day-to-day basis, so to speak. I find that really quite amazing. It's much like what we're doing here. This is talk about what's going on in Dagrolath, is much more interesting than what is going on in the modern world. That's part of that counterspell. It changes the perspective so that we are no longer in the prison of the tawdry daily stuff. We're able to think about something that's actually much more not glamorous, just really much more fascinating. I think Christopher said that, didn't he, when he was on the front lines there in World War II, getting the manuscripts for the work. I think he said that too. It was much more interesting to see the War of the Rings going on than the war there in Europe against the Nazis,
Mhm.
which that's kind of intriguing. Kind of intriguing.
Yeah, it is
So,
because and I think, I mean, just lining those two things up side by side. Um, I think that captures really the essence of why does Tolkien's thing not only have staying power but enduring relevance and importance
yeah,
for us to
right.
understand is that, and this is why does the applicability thing work? Why does it work applicable to World War II? And just as much, if you were living 500 years earlier, you could apply it to the 30 Years' War, or
Mm,
500 years from now in the future, you could apply it to whatever's going on then with equal legitimacy, is because just like within the world of the Legendarium, the Ainulindale, the Silmarillion, the Lord of the Rings, things are happening the same thing is happening at multiple levels. And
mm,
so, in many ways, the war of the rings is every war. It's at its
mm,
cosmic level, cosmic
mm,
mythological level. That's the same story playing out down at the level of 1935, 1940, something, right? Same thing
yeah,
playing out in the 1520s, 1580s.
Yeah, and in the 1580s, we were talking the other night about why it was that Shakespeare had such enduring power. I
Hmm.
think it's a similar business. He was crafting worlds on the stage that people were far more interested in than the streets of London, or the
Hmm.
current battle between kings that was going on.
Right. It's not
So,
just the current thing. You know, what I mean, that's like,
yeah,
why is Macbeth so great?
yeah, yeah.
Allegorically, is it's not even allegorically, but is it? Are there hints in Macbeth about regicide and, okay, let's not screw around with the legitimate king because otherwise we'll, devolve into, absolute. Does it have political relevance to his immediate moment? Yeah, absolutely. In sometimes in over the top ways. Um, but also profound, I would say, insight. People are always so focused on all the insights that it has. No, it demonstrates, right?
Yeah.
It doesn't, it's not an insight that it has, it's a truth that it demonstrates about some really messed up human psychology. you
Yes,
know?
yes, indeed. And if we use the language we've been using, it weaves a spell in the
Exactly.
sense of the words and the world that's created. I mean, for instance, when you walk away from one of those plays, and you might have a moment where you're thinking, "Gosh, this is really lousy that I have to go back to whatever my job as a
Yeah.
tanner or whatever." And you suddenly think, well, to be or not to be, that's the question, and whether 'tis nobler in the mind to slough off with slings and arrows of outrageous fortune. You start thinking in terms of the words that were created on
Uh-huh.
that stage, and you're in that world. You're in
Because
that
you're
world.
reliving that experience. When you're reciting it like that, you're reliving that experience, right? You're
Yeah.
not just repeating some dictum. You're not just reciting instructions or a
Yeah.
reminder or a law. You're contemplating on the meaning of the whole experience that's conveyed in those words. I thought you were going to say you come back from the theater and you go into your office. And you're like, is this a dagger I see before me?
You could do that too, I'm sure. Whatever the case, like his works seem to have that resounding power in the same way that Tolkien's have this resounding power, this lingering thing, framing the way that you deal with the regular world.
Yeah.
I find that remarkable. There aren't a lot of artists that do that, I think. There
Yeah.
are a good amount, but there aren't. It's not like every artist does that. There are some artists that they're just kind of like Piet Mondrian, for instance, or who's the guy that slings paint? Um, Jackson Pollock.
Yeah. That's right.
They're kind of temporary. Or
Yeah.
you might, you have entertainment like Ozzy and Harriet or something like that, but the Honeymooners or whatever. But it's
Yeah.
not. I mean, it's not the same thing. It's just kind of fun, street
Right.
street comedy.
Right.
Um,
Yeah. It's a Punch and Judy show.
yeah, right, right. Well, it's been a good discussion. I think it's a good place to kind of say, let's say it for the day.
I think
And
so. I think it sounds good.
next time we get together, I do want to talk about this. I want to find out more about your take on this whole Arthel character, and I really am interested in Maeglin. Maeglin is a really interesting character to me, so I
Hmm.
want to talk about him next time too. And also his very interesting Batman-like father, right? Aol.
Yeah.
So, but anyway, we'll get into all that next time. For now, this
All
this,
right.
this has been good. So, thank you
Sounds
so
good.
much,
All
sir. I
right.
appreciate it, and take care of yourself. And we'll see you in the
My
near
pleasure.
future.
Thank you,
All
sir.
right.
All
Bye
right.
bye.
Bye.